Okay, so for handout 13G, we're going to focus on the spinal nerves themselves. They actually branch off of the spinal cord in an interesting way. They're all typically the same. All 31 pairs are branching off this way. So let's look at handout 13G to get started. And I'm going to focus on the picture here for a minute because what I've done is I've color coded the picture to match motor and sensory pathways. So what I did is I color coded the motor pathway to be red and the sensory pathways to be blue. So if you look at this is kind of like what we just talked about with that reflex arc. You've got a sensory receptor in your skin. So let's say you touch something, your skin picks that up with its sensory receptor. The sensory receptor will then move that information through a sensory nerve, which is blue, to the spinal cord. But if you notice, the spinal cord and the spinal nerves, they're kind of like on and off ramps to a highway. We don't just have one branch coming off the spinal cord, but each spinal nerve has these roots. So we have a root in the back called the dorsal root, and we have a root in the front called the ventral root. The dorsal root is sensory. So that information that's coming from your skin is going to come from the body to the brain, and it's going to move through this sensory tract into the dorsal root and then into the spinal cord. The spinal cord's gray matter can then decide what to do with this and then send a motor sensory pathway back to the body. So that goes through the ventral root and then to the motor muscle fibers, causing us to move our muscles. So when we look at this, we need to think that there are kind of an on-ramp dorsal root to the spinal cord and an off-ramp ventral root. These are one-way streets, right? So an on and an off ramp, you can't just take either way to get on and off the highway. So the dorsal root is the on ramp for sensory, and the ventral root is the off ramp for motor. Now, I do have some other things that we need to mention. So what I did here is I just kind of defined everything. So here we have what's called the dorsal root. And I just wrote exactly what I said. It receives the sensory input and sends it to the spinal cord. So this information's coming into the dorsal root. Now, the actual spinal nerve itself is right here. And this diagram shows it as just this little tiny section, but it can be very long, right? I mean, this could be stretched out as it's going to your body. So where this circle is can be a very long nerve, but it branches, and you have two major branches that go to your body from the spinal nerve. We have a dorsal, what are called ramus. So this is a branch that goes to your back, and then you have a ventral ramus that branches and goes to your front. So here I just wrote that the dorsal ramus supply nerves to the skin and muscles of the posterior of your back. All right. Now, in contrast to that, you've got a ventral ramus. So every spinal nerve has a ventral ramus, and the ventral ramus supplies nerves to the skin and the muscles of the front, or your anterior. So down here below, I just write that the ventral ramus is what is supplying the nerve information to the front of our body. Then we have our ventral root that sends motor signals out of the spinal cord to the spinal nerve. All right. So another thing to kind of keep in mind is that ramus is singular. And if we're talking about both the ventral and dorsal ramus together, we call them rami. That's a plural name. So rami are the branches that allow information to move to and from your body. Now, if you notice, what's pretty cool about this is that the rami and the spinal nerve itself are two-way highways. These nerves contain pathways for both sensory and motor. So you have kind of a two-way street going through these spinal nerves. You've got neurons that are motor neurons that are carrying it out to the body. And then you have sensory neurons that are carrying information from the body back to the brain. Now remember that even though these are two-way highways, the spinal nerve is a two-way highway. If you are a neuron, you have to be one or the other. So there is a pathway within this spinal nerve that is either motor or sensory. Then when we get towards the spinal cord, when we reach the root, we branch off to these on and off ramps. So the on ramp is a sensory dorsal root, and the off ramp is this ventral motor root. Now the dorsal roots contain a swelling of neural tissue called a ganglion. And ganglion, it says they receive mechanical, thermal, chemical stimuli, and they send it to the spinal cord. These ganglia, it says posterior ganglia, these are processing centers. They're kind of like mini brains. In the human, they just process that thermal, so temperature, chemical, mechanical information, and then send it to the spinal cord. In other organisms like insects, for example, remember I'm an insect scientist, ganglia, I should say, provide a more important role. So like if you take a grasshopper and you look at its nervous system, it does have a brain. They actually don't call it a brain in an insect because even though it is a brain, it's in their head. It has a different name. Don't worry about that. But they also have a series of ganglia that go along their neurocord. And these ganglia control large segments of their body. So this is why, a fly can do all these acrobatics with their wings as they're flying through the air. It's because their brain isn't sending all that information. The ganglia are controlling big parts of their body. So kind of a gruesome example of this would be you can take a grasshopper. Let's say you have a very pregnant female grasshopper. You can actually cut her head off and put her down, and her ganglia that control her reproductive system can still cause her to lay eggs. So her brain isn't a major or as major of an organ as it is in a human. Obviously, if you cut a human's head off, the rest of our body is not doing anything. But an insect is different. So ganglia do exist in humans. I went off on a tangent there. But ganglia do exist in humans, and they are processing centers. They process information and send it on into the spinal cord. But they're just not as important, I guess, as another organism like an insect. So that is our introduction to Handout 13G. And now we're going to kind of look at all of the different spinal nerves and how they are branching off of the spinal cord itself for our final handout of this chapter, which I believe is 13H. So that'll be next. All right. Take care.